Hello, and thank you for joining me this afternoon for the next Nemensa webinar, this time on strategic impact evaluation, measuring the return on digital. In this session, I'll be expanding on a framework for digital impact assessment and showing how organizations from micro to enterprise size can use this process for projects, services, products, and programs of work. The session will be about 45 minutes, although we will have some time earmarked at the end for questions. So feel free to send questions in as we go along or fire them over on Twitter. I'll deal with them at the end. So just firstly, to introduce myself, I'm Tim Dixon. I'm currently a senior UX consultant at Nemensa. This talk and this project that I've been working on kind of combines my current role and previous background. Previous to this, I was a principal consultant in socioeconomic research. I also studied human factors psychology previously, and I just generally have a love of data. As I say, this talk combines several of those threads. So this talk will focus on 4 different areas. What is impact? Why impact matters? The digital impact framework, and the process of strategic impact evaluation. So to begin, what is impact? Impact isn't always understood in the same way by everyone. It's the kind of word that can be used in quite a specific sense by some people and in quite a general sense by others. So I'm going to give just a few definitions that hone in on where we're coming from. So Business Directory says that impact is the tangible change that research provides, be it in a measure of tangible and intangible effects of one thing's or entity's action or influence upon another. The Oxford University e-Research Centre says impact is the tangible change that research provides, be it in policy, business, industry, or society. And as we look at it in this context, impact is the measurable long-term consequence of digital activity of lasting value. So we can see that impact can be both positive or negative, or indeed, it could be both in different ways. We need to be able to break impact down and understand different elements of what it is. And maybe at some point, we can see both positive and negative aspects to the impact. Impact is also challenging to measure accurately. I love this example. This is from a research paper that's surveyed the C-suite across different companies, asking how much impact they considered their CX initiatives had had. This survey, though, forgot to inquire if these initiatives could actually have a negative impact. In my opinion, this is likely to be a biased response that we see in this. So again, in identifying how it can be quite tricky to really get a decent, robust measure of impact. Following on from that, we have the traditional metrics that are around, such as Net Promoter Score, customer satisfaction, app store ratings, and cost per click, to name but a few. There are many of these. I mean, these can all be seen to have fundamental flaws. For example, Net Promoter Score simply has no real place in quantitative analysis, as it has no better predictive value than many other measures, and the premise that it's a net score is actually incoherent. The CSAT can easily be rigged within a digital journey to give a positive response. App store ratings. Well, who's received a request to rate an app at the exact point you've had a positive feedback response from it? This is an easy biasing of that response process. And cost per click. It's not really as irrelevant as you want to be thinking, really, in terms of profit per click. And there are more examples of this kind of thinking. So to overcome this, we're going to look at a different model. The model we use, impact can be measured more robustly using a logic model approach. We look for, in the logic model, the golden thread that causally connects the inputs to the impacts. So you can see the inputs start on the left-hand side. They logically lead to activities that can be carried out. They have logical outputs, like literally the things that are done, but then there are knock-on effects, which we call the outcomes, and the knock-on effects, kind of longer term, bigger scale, are the impacts that we're referring to in this case. This is sometimes referred to as the theory of change, which we shall return to later, as the theory of change allows us to work back from what we plan to be impacts to understand what needs to come before. One other aspect is we need to consider the counterfactual. That is, what would have happened anyway? So a nice quote here to sum up some of this initially from Avinash Kaushik and his great Occam's Razor blog. So one way of removing silos and focusing on the entire business is to leverage acquisition, behavior, and outcome metrics. This will allow, may force, our senior business leaders to see the complete picture, see more of cause and effect, and create incentives for the disparate teams to work together. So moving on, why impact matters. So we've got a few different elements to this, but I like to conceive of impact as purpose at scale. As we'll see, the impact model scales from small projects to large programs. But as we'll begin, we'll think about the individual. What are their needs? What's their purpose? The Japanese philosophy of ikigai presents 4 facets or drivers for an individual to have purpose in life. What you love doing, what the world needs, what you're good at doing, and what you can get paid for doing. And that sweet spot that intersects all 4 in the middle, that's your ikigai or purpose in life. So if we have an individual who has their purpose, then we can see organizations as a collection of individuals, each with their own ikigai or purpose. So organizational value can be derived from the shared purpose of the individuals within the organization. We can start to think about Simon Sinek's Start With Why model, which posits that while most successful organizational leaders will share with their staff what they do well, only some will clearly instill how to do it, and few will get across why the organization is doing it and why people should care. This why, this organizational value, I see as the individual purpose scaling. But the question is, how do we kind of measure that value, measure that why? Well, this is where the impact comes in. Measuring impact provides a proxy for the value provided by the organization. You can see we have the individual purpose leads to the grouping of the value for an organization, and then at bigger scale, impact is the measurement which then feeds back to the individual to tell them that purpose of the organization. So evaluating impact, therefore, provides a tool for communicating to society about those, how well the values of the organization are being represented. It provides a tool for speaking to the C-suite about what needs to be done and why it should be funded. It provides a tool for empowering staff to care about what's being done, for inspiring new ideas, and also for showing the tangible and less tangible returns on investment, in this case in digital. Here's another great quote. The culture of a workplace, an organization's values, norms, and practices has a huge impact on our happiness and success. That's from Adam Grant, Professor of Occupational Psychology in the States. So moving on once more, we'll get into some more of the details now. This is the digital impact framework upon which the evaluation process is based. So there are 4 value drivers of digital impact as we've defined it. So the social or societal driver, the economic driver, operational driver, and the innovation driver. And we can start to overlay these 4 drivers into the logic model approach that we saw before. So we see the inputs, activities, etc. And then at the end, we see the impacts are splitting down into these 4 different drivers. Now, the 4 value drivers of impact can be split again into those which are external to the organization. So social drivers and economic, they're both outside the organization. You're looking to make changes to society, make changes to regional economic profits, as it were. And then the internal to the organization are operational drivers, so changing processes, making efficiencies, for example, and also innovation within the organization. So coming up with new ideas and new ways to spin off from current ideas. So again, we'll start to split this, the table and the model further, so we can see the different elements more clearly. At this point, it's useful to think about the different metrics that might be useful for for picking apart some of these different issues. So in each of these cases, we've split apart what different types of metric we might want to be considering. And there are the key to understanding metrics for using the DIF framework, so that we'd really want to be understanding an individual project and an individual program's nuances first, before selecting the most appropriate metrics. But these are just some exemplars, and also we might talk about more off-the-shelf, kind of easier routes through the metric decision process. But in terms of the examples we have here for social or societal drivers, we might look to measure improved experiences in one form and another. We might look at attitude and behavior changes within a group, a target group, or a population at large. We might think about increased well-being further down the line through usage of some product or service. And we might look at monitored sentiment changes. And these could certainly be through thinking about things like social media monitoring. At the economic level, we can think about increased sales or customer retention, stopping sales going to other businesses or organizations. For more charitable organizations, it might be a metric might be funding applications or successful funding bids that go through. Then we start to see the more kind of the stronger economic factors, such as direct and indirect full-time employment within an organization, or turnover increase. And then we can think about the real end impacts, which are net additional gross value added at a regional or a national level. And so this would mean that going beyond the organization itself, because when an organization makes money, the money spills into the local region, therefore allowing more people to spend money within that region. Operationally speaking, we might look at improved staff experience, staff knowledge and increased skills, efficiencies generated within the organization, and monetary savings. And then on the innovation side, we've got the novel product or service development itself. We could consider patent applications, spin-off projects or companies, and also we could think about the widespread adoption of new processes. So the other factor I've also mentioned is the counterfactual. So impact measurement on this robust scale needs to also consider the flip side of what's actually being measured. That is, what would have happened anyway? It's a really key question. Okay, we've made some changes, but without this intervention, without this product, without this service, what would have happened anyway? Maybe those changes still would have happened naturally within the situation. Maybe they wouldn't. Ways we can consider this are, is there a control group? If we're early in a project, we might want to consider another group that isn't going to be using the product or service. We might be able to tap into collecting data from them as well. We can then compare those two groups. We would really want to statistically model the net difference between what would have, or as far as we know, what might have happened and what did happen. And then on the really kind of stronger, more economic side, we can think about additionality. The net additionality is considers things like, we got some positive effect in the area that we're interested in, but did it come at the cost of another area, another region of the country actually having a bit of a dip? Did we just steal some of that impact, so not generate genuine new impact, for example? There are various different ways we can consider that, and those would come down to some quite specific statistical modeling processes. Okay, so at this point, we've kind of gone through the basis for the framework, and now we're going to break down into a bit more detail into the strategic impact evaluation process itself. So we really want to be understanding how we can use the framework to take it further and actually go out there. So the strategic impact evaluation considers these internal impacts of drivers, the external drivers as well. But we can also then think about it in terms of a planning and implementation phase, and also the final impact assessment phase. And different organizations, at different times, or indeed different projects, might want to consider any one of these four quadrants that we're going to consider. So for example, if you're thinking just internally to your organization and you're at the planning and implementation stage, you might consider what can be done within the project to improve processes, to generate new ideas, for example. If you're looking more externally, you might consider how might we reach new audiences or stakeholders? What might we do to generate money in the local and national economy? If you're going further into the impact assessment itself, internally, you'll consider what will be the knock-on effects of efficiencies and innovations. And on that final bigger scale, external facing impacts, what will be the increased well-being, the positive sentiment, what will be the gross value added and additionality of this project. So we can see that measuring any or all of these will have different outcomes for the organization itself, and we'll be able to improve things both within the processes that are taking place, as well as within the planned strategy that's going to come next. So again, we can overlay this onto the diff model that we've been looking at before. We can see that the planning and implementation more relates to the inputs, activities, and outputs kind of phase, and the impact assessment aspect more relates from outputs through to outcomes and through to that impact value driver phase. So next, I want to think a little bit about UX strategy. So this is the Nomensa triple diamond. And just to add a quick note, I hope you all caught my colleague Charlie Martin's webinar on UX strategy, which is the most recent one that we have done, and where he presented this in quite a lot of detail. So if you didn't catch that, it'd be good to see if you can catch up on it. We like to think of UX strategy as having this third diamond. While most people in the design community will be familiar with the second diamond, the design, and the third, the develop aspects, we consider the first diamond as being that very early stage strategic perspective. Within that, we think about what is the vision for this project or this offering, what will be the roadmap, and certainly what is the value proposition that sets this apart for the organization. So with that in mind, we can now see that the UX strategy fits very closely and it aligns with the impact approach that we have here. So the impact strategy and the UX strategy map onto each other one-to-one, really. So the vision in the UX strategy informs our impact and outcome goals. By having a vision, we can then more closely define what will we want to achieve, what impacts do we want to create. Our roadmap then relates to what outputs and activities we need to carry out. So much more of that kind of granular detail of what we will be doing. And then the value proposition is what sets us aside. It allows us to create our causal connection between these different elements. It allows us to start thinking about what assumptions go alongside what we're suggesting. And as you can see here, I mentioned before about a theory of change, and this really sums up what is our theory of change. How do we go about defining what the impacts are, what comes before the outputs and activities, and those causal connections and assumptions that underlie them. So once again, we can reflect back onto the model and see that we have the strategic string across the top. So we've got the vision, roadmap, and value proposition we can work on, and then this really reflects the theory of change. And as things are, this is our full framework, and different elements of it may be, again, more or less pertinent for different organizations and different projects at different points in their lifetime. So I want to talk a little bit now about when will be the most appropriate time to carry out a strategic impact evaluation. So think about timing. It may be, as I mentioned, that you're early on in a project. You're thinking about that planning and implementation phase. And it might be, in fact, that in terms of thinking about our triple diamond approach, you're more conscious about designing or delivering those second and third diamonds, as we put it. It might be then that a planning and implementation approach, considering these kind of elements, these questions, as we've already gone through, might be the more appropriate point for you to be coming in and speaking and considering these factors. Alternatively, you might be just at the start of a big strategic piece of thinking. Really, any strategic thinking needs to be defining metrics, and they should be both long-term metrics and more near-term metrics. So it's the ideal point to be thinking about that kind of final phase impact assessment aspect, if you are kind of really taking your UX strategy by the teeth. But of course, ideally, you'd be thinking more holistically and across all three, planning through strategy, through design, development, and delivery. So that in that case, you would really want to consider across the board of the elements of what we're going to be talking about. So to put this another way, we can also consider the timing in relation to where you are with planning a project. So for example, it's useful to consider what elements or activities you might want to think through. So if you're at the very start of planning a project or thinking about getting some funding, estimating what impact you'll generate will allow you to justify that funding, whether that be to the C-suite, whether that be to some external funding body, etc. So that's the very early phase, number one. In number two, we have planning what activities will actually create impact within your strategy. So we need to go through and think about that impact in relation to what can be done to generate it. Number three, whilst the project in full flow, we want to be monitoring the impacts to see where improvements can be made. So it's an iterative feedback process that can help to boost the impacts and the processes really that are going alongside them. And then finally, at the end, you want to evaluate the impact, to demonstrate the value. Again, either going back to your original funders, going back to society in general, and going back to your staff and getting people to really care, as we said, about that value that you deliver and the individual purpose that people come to you with. So we'll run through a few steps that can be taken. Then we'll also have a hypothetical example that will take you through each of the steps, and we'll end with an example of how this might look in practice, using the framework itself. Again, with some data that's very close to some projects that we've looked at, but is hypothetical. So firstly, the first step would be thinking about, are we looking at a planning and implementation or full impact assessment? As we said, really depends on where you're at, what your thinking is, and how big a scale you want to really be going into. The next step would be to explore the strategic context and rationale for the digital offering that's there. This will help to establish the theory of change. Next, we would establish the priority impacts. Are these internal or external? This is important because we've said there are 4 value drivers, but not every organization, not every project will be prioritizing all 4 of these different value drivers. Some sort of charitable organizations will most likely see the social as being the top priority. Enterprise organizations might see economic drivers as being more important, for example. Some might see all 4 as being at the heart of it. Some might see only a couple. And we'd always suggest at least 2, maybe 3 drivers as being important to consider. The next step will be to establish workable, SMART metrics. That's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So SMART metrics that can be monitored and collected. Next, we would ensure monitoring tools and processes are in place. So are those monitoring tools and processes going to be within the organization running the project, or externally to the organization, and thinking about how to gather the data? There'll probably be some types of user research or larger scale data collection as it stands. So we'll go through and look at the various different ways that we can grab that data, and then we'd analyze it. And then importantly, we'd report. But the key thing here is to understand it's not just a single one-off report. This is a longer term. We're looking at impacts across a year or 2 years even. So while it doesn't have to be a continuous piece of work, it's useful to follow up in, say, 6 months or 12 months, see what data has been collected by that point from passive and more active methods, and then reanalyze the data, see how the impacts are developing, see how improvements can be made, and finally, at the end of the project, see what has been established and where that value has really been derived. So we're going to go through this again with an example that I've come up with. It's a hypothetical scenario, as I've said. You might have, for example, a mobile health spin-out company who sees a gap in the market relating to efficiencies in how hip surgery is allocated and how it might utilize the latest data trends to fill the gap. So this is our basis of our scenario. We'll go through each of these steps in turn as to what they might do. So given the large scale program level nature of this offering, we'd consider this as covering planning, implementation, and impact assessments. This will be a full assessment process. We can support the organisation with building their vision, roadmap and value proposition. So in terms of a vision, you might talk about wanting to bring about widespread regional changes to process it within hospitals, at the same time as increasing patient confidence in the process and life satisfaction in those undergoing surgery. The roadmap will be delivered through a mobile app that can intelligently analyse and prioritise surgery, while the value proposition will be based around cutting-edge access to current data and machine learning to predict patterns of surgery needs. Again, this is all hypothetical, but it's a realistic and certainly seeing more and more of these kind of mobile projects coming out. Our theory of change, therefore, relevant to this, would be there is a need to improve operation waiting times within UK hospitals for patients and staff looking to have these carried out. By investing in intelligent mobile infrastructure that can learn patterns of demand and behaviour, we can bring about immediate awareness of this new process for public, get people using the service faster and with a more positive experience compared to currently, and longer term, improve wellbeing outcomes for those using the service. At the same time, training for staff will improve job satisfaction and increase efficiencies within the hospitals it's working, saving the service money in the longer term. So next, priority impacts are likely to be an internal impact of operational improvements for nurses, doctors and the hospital, and externally, improved patient waiting times and outcomes. But we'll consider all of these impacts as being important in this case. In terms of smart metrics, we'll come on to that. And in terms of the approaches to gathering data, given the nature of service users, we're likely to use a combination of social media monitors, some lean data collection, internal process data analysis, and staff surveys. And it's really important to understand that while we can run large-scale surveying, etc., we've also been exploring lean data collection, which is very much about pinpointing 4 or 5 just key questions that you can fire out to a large number of people that have used the service in order to extract just the most significant, most important pieces of information from them in a robust and reliable way. So we would then review across time and catch up as necessary to analyze data. So we'll move on and look at this in practice. How might this look? So we would have on the inputs, we might consider a government funding, government grant of some amount, and private sector funding to match or to bring it up to a total. Those would be the inputs. The activities that are going to be carried out, there's going to be a lot of planning, ideation, there's going to be design and development. We're going to be looking at training people. We're going to look at the launch of the resource and the public relations that go alongside that. So the discovery and development sprints are going to be in there, the design iterations. This is the full package of work that's actually going to be done. In this example, I've actually got broken down into all 4 of the value drivers, although we've prioritized 2 of them. So first of all, we'll look at the innovation value driver. So an output would be one novel service is deployed and one new app working. That is a basic pure output. But the knock-on effects, what might be the knock-on effects of this? So we might aim to have, say, 10 trusts using the service and app and 1 spin-off service developed within a period of time. And we might have the service mainstreamed and the apps rolled out as a standard over a certain amount of time. In terms of the operational process value drivers, we would hope, say, 200 people would be trained and 2 process documents created to support this. The knock-on effects of that are, due to the people being trained, 50 surgeons can take up the resource and 60% feel an increase in confidence in fulfilling surgery in a timely manner, for example. And then we might see that the average waiting time is reduced by, for example, 2 days across the board within these hospitals longer term. And this would mean that costs will be reduced by an amount. Or again, the clear point being that we can set defined measurable goals to these. And we can also imagine staff increasing in job satisfaction by a given amount. In terms of economic value drivers, we might see 50 jobs created for the app and the service, and 20 jobs in training. These direct jobs mean that, for example, 150 indirect and induced full-time employed might be employed within the region. What this means is that because we've supported the direct creation of jobs, those people will spend money and go out into the region, and therefore they will create new jobs because they have money to spend within the region. So these indirect and induced jobs are those knock-on effects again. And we might also think about new funding opportunities that spin out. And then further down the line, we might be looking to make a gross value added, which is a regional GDP figure of 20 million, for example, a cost benefit ratio of some amount. And then finally, our social value drivers. We might think about 5,000 people being made aware of the new service. 2,000 public being selected for earlier surgery, 5,000 people maybe sharing info about the service. And then as we see the final line, we might want to get 1,000 people positively posting about hip surgery on social media, and 500 people with increased life satisfaction scores as we go through. So that is, in essence, as I say, a hypothetical, but a very realistic, and as we're going through, we're seeing more and more examples of how we can look into the nuances of bigger and smaller programs of work, and going right back down to individual projects and products being developed at different scales. As we come to a close here, just want to think about one final quote from Chuck Robbins, CEO of Cisco. It's imperative for us to consider how all that we do makes an impact on the world around us. And then with that, I'd like to say thank you, and just to say, whether you're deeply involved in strategic experience design or in the early stages of planning a new project, love to speak to you more so we can support your work and to ensure significant impact is delivered and demonstrated. And I think we do have a bit of time for questions if there are any. Okay, so we've got a question from Emmy. So changing attitudes is one thing, but changing behaviour is a very separate challenge. What are your opinions on measuring against these metrics? Is it always representative of societal change? It is a very good point. Behaviour change, as we all know, is a big challenge for most organisations to consider. Within the framework, we can still see that there would be a number of factors that we'd want to get across. And for behaviour change, we would still envisage it being within the social kind of band of value driver. The one thing about the wider social band is that, dependent on the project or what kind of service we're talking about, that's going to have very, very different considerations. For example, coming from a kind of small scale UX project, that would be the immediate outputs might be just changes in measured changes in a person's usage of a website. That's a basic behavior change. But if you're thinking about on a much bigger scale service design piece, it's a very, very different kind of scale that we can start to think about it. This is where it becomes much more important to think about starting this process, this impact assessment process, early, i.e. at the start of the project. Ideally, then we can understand what the behavior of that group is that are going to be using the service. And I mean, in an ideal world, we talk about finding a control group who are not going to end up using the service. And that shows the clearest difference between the behaviors of the people who are and the behaviors of the people who aren't. But that's not always viable. And we are actually looking at other ways to look back. In fact, we've got some social media monitoring tools which allow us to look back to different stages of, say, on Twitter, into the past as well as the future. So while it's not an ideal approach, we could also envisage, say, for example, we were working with one organization, seeing what kind of feedback they are receiving in relation to something. We might also consider what kinds of feedback a very equivalent organization is looking at. So we think about this in a wide range of different methods for tapping into this. I hope that's got to grips with your question somewhat. I've got another question. Oh no. Just a comment from Ronnie. Thoroughly enjoyed that, so thanks very much. If there's any more questions. Oh yes, and again from Ronnie. How do you get around resistance while implementing the framework from the wider business? Well, it's an interesting pointer. I think the most important thing to think about when looking at the impact is that it can make positive change, and it can provide ways to improve services as well. It's never going to be, getting early understanding of what the purpose is really important. So running through slides like we have done today is really useful. But yeah, certainly getting across that the process can support those different the different points within a project, and help to just make improvements, as well as actually get some final measurements that basically I think every manager these days is driven by some kind of metrics, and getting the most robust metrics available often gives a quite good justification for running this kind of process. Any more questions? Okay, well, thanks very much again. It's been a real pleasure to go through this this afternoon. And we'll call it a day there. Thanks, bye.